BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Black Box Ned 88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. Today we're going to be going back to 2006, very precisely June 6th of that year. And on that day, an individual named Jason Moss lost his life, suicide from a gunshot wound to the head. Now, we got onto this subject because recently we have been talking about the serial killer John Wayne Gacy. And I would have to say that even for this channel, we have to go back to 2019 to look at some of our serial killer discussions. I would say in the fall of 2019, we had a very pivotal moment on the channel where we were talking about serial killers from time to time, but that was at the time that we really began to get into serial killer psychology, and a lot of that has to do with the individual, Jason Moss, and his explorations into the way that serial killers would think. Of course, John Wayne Gacy, but there will be some other names that we will mention that he was connected to as well. Jason Moss was a college freshman that wanted to begin connecting with serial killers. As I understand the way that the narrative comes out, is that he began looking through some books, and he found a book called The Killer Clown about John Wayne Gacy, and thought that the victims that John Wayne Gacy targeted were somewhat similar to his physical appearance as well as his age range, and then that began the correspondence with serial killers in prison, and they turned this into a movie in 2010 called Dear Mr. Gacy. And during his lifetime, Jason Moss co-authored a book called The Last Victim, and it was co-authored with Jeffrey Kotler, who was, I believe he was his counseling professor. That's what I read earlier. And the subtitle of the book is A True Life Journey into the Mind of a Serial Killer. But as we said, though, this story does take a darker turn because Jason Moss did indeed commit suicide in 2006. I'm going to jump over here to a website called pw.com, Publishers Weekly. And what they have is, the subtitle is A Slight Bit of Misdirection. And one more time, that was A True Life Journey into the Mind of a Serial Killer. The subtitle is A Slight Bit of Misdirection. Moss offers us a journey into his own mind instead of the mind of someone else. He offers us this journey as someone who is obsessed with the minds of serial killers. As a UNLV freshman, he corresponded with John Wayne Gacy, then on death row. He also accepted collect calls from Gacy, who attempted to talk to him about committing incest with his younger brother. Enthralled by his proximity to sociopathology, Moss expanded his list of psycho pen pals to include Charles Manson, Richard Ramirez the Night Stalker, and Jeffrey Dahmer. Now, we've talked a lot about Charles Manson on this channel in 2020, and back in 2019, we started talking about Jeffrey Dahmer as well. First, we did some things on John Wayne Gacy, then Jeffrey Dahmer, and then Ted Bundy. I really thought that if we're going to talk about serial killers, we should have some of the discussions about perhaps the more famous ones out there. I know there are countless pieces of information about Gacy and Bundy and Dahmer. I would say the only person that we haven't mentioned on this channel that was on that list was Richard Ramirez. And the only reason I haven't talked about Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, is for the same reason why we haven't done an upload on toilet paper that's covered in shit. I mean, that's all really Richard Ramirez is. There's just not a single thing to say other than he is a piece of slime. End of discussion. Now, going back to some of the things here with Jason Moss, I think a lot of us have this type of fascination. And as I said, this was a pivotal moment in the channel because we're really going away from what we used to do, talking about unsolved murders, talking about, okay, here's a theory about what might have happened, and just looking more at serial killer psychology and what really is going on. Because as I began to listen to more and more true crime programs, as well as reading things and watching the documentaries, I began to notice that, hey, wait, there are major patterns, trends, and similarities that are going on here. And Jason Moss also wanted to use these relationships with serial killers, particularly with John Wayne Gacy. As I understand it, he wanted to use it as a way to learn more information, see if some way, somehow, that he could extract new secrets from these individuals. Because one of the things that Jason Moss was noticing was that perhaps if he pretended to be the type of victim that these individuals wanted to hear. Manson might want to talk to somebody a little bit different. Ramirez as well. Jeffrey Dahmer might want to correspond with someone a little bit different. So he would create these types of borderline fictionalized personas. He would say things that were not true, in other words, to get a desired outcome from the serial killer. He thought that he could manipulate these individuals. And by Jason Moss's own account, and you can hear more about this in an interview that he did on 2020, as well as, of course, from the book The Last Victim, which he has written here. He was talking about how he was 18 years old. He was very cocky. He thought he knew everything, or at the very least, he thought that he could outsmart these individuals just by playing the game and rigging the system this way. He thought that he could outsmart them, but he really found that that was not the case. And it would turn out that he would end up being the one who was manipulated. So let's go back to this article here, and then let's hear some things. Despite suffering nightmares triggered by his grisly correspondence, Moss kept contacting with them, and eventually he got in touch with an FBI agent who handled Gacy, and flew to Illinois to speak with him during his spring break. He spoke to Gacy alone in a locked room, unmonitored, with the psychopath who had raped, tortured, and murdered 33 other boys and young men just like himself. Now, to say something about that is, I understand the way that they laid this out, and they show this all in the film Dear Mr. Gacy, which we've discussed on this channel in the past. The way that I understand the reason why this thing was all unmonitored is Jason Moss was given the I guess you'd say the promise that he would be talking to Gacy behind glass over a telephone, and that there would be guards present. However, it turned out that Gacy had bribed one of the prison guards to pretend to be a warden, and that he fed Jason Moss fraudulent information, and that because Gacy was on good terms with the prison guards, that's why it was arranged this way, that Moss ended up being in the room alone with John Wayne Gacy. And the thing, though, that I found quite surprising is there were multiple meetings between Jason Moss and John Wayne Gacy. I mean, Jason Moss said that, even, you can hear this in the interview he did with 2020 for yourselves. He's saying that he did this, and John Wayne Gacy is just trying to talk him into sexual sadism, more or less, and he's insulting him and degrading him. At one point, Jason even starts crying, and then for a while, he actually is able to get Gacy to back off, and he just felt absolutely horrible. He said he felt degraded, and that's one of the reasons why this book is titled The Last Victim. But then another thing that to say about that is that wasn't enough to keep Jason Moss away. I mean, I am utterly stunned that that's the way that this would play out. And once again, this is going to be a little bit different than the film Dear Mr. Gacy. If you do get to watch that, I highly recommend it for a couple reasons that we'll say in a second. But the thing is that he went back to see Gacy again, and after that encounter, he just could not do any more. Now, because Jason Moss committed suicide in 2006 at the age of 31, a lot of people are really beginning to wonder just how much of the serial killer exploration played in that. How much did that play on his mental health and such? Because there's another reason, though. We should say, he began corresponding with Richard Ramirez, someone whom I do not think very highly of, as I said in the beginning. But Richard Ramirez very famously has that pentagram on his hand. And Jason Moss began just delving into the world of satanic rituals, learning about it. This type of curiosity with just anything that has the slightest resemblance to what we call the darkness. We're talking about things, the occult, or just the human evil, whatever it is that would drive these people to kill. A lot of us have that type of fascination. I have that type of fascination. You probably have that type of fascination if you've found your way to this far off corner of YouTube, where some people call it morbid curiosity. I sometimes call it miserable curiosity, as lousy as that sounds. But you just have this, you want to know what is going on with this type of thought process. And that is one of the biggest reasons why we talk about these things on the channel. And I did say that Jason Moss was an influence because we really wanted to look at, number one, why are people thinking this way? What are the motivations to make people do what they do? But also, after just listening to more and more of this stuff, you're like, hey, wait a second. That is quite similar to the case that we heard before. And then the next case, it all just seems to build up. It's almost like a snowball effect. And you're looking at these serial killers And you're looking at the abuse that they experienced in their childhood, as well as the ways in which they're committing their crimes. And you're like, this is not an accident, or this is not just simply genetics, or this is not just simply part of their brain isn't functioning normally. There are patterns, trends, and similarities that are going on in people's social environments that contribute to these actions, and we want to try and understand them. And believe it or not, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a psychiatrist. I think there's a sense of value in hearing just an outsider take on the subject because, just somebody who watches the documentaries and listens to podcasts and reads articles just like anybody else saying, hey, wait a second, what about this? We already have the mainstream inside the box thinking. Let's look for a little bit of outside the box thinking. So I highly commend Jason Moss for doing that. But as he began to explore things like with Richard Ramirez, he would get more into the occult. We said satanic worship and practices. And you might have noticed something about committing suicide on June 6th of 2006, 6606. And people famously said that that was 666. One thing that I can tell you firsthand from an insider perspective, I was around in 2006. June 6, 2006 was the scheduled day for my high school graduation. I would have been, I was 18 years old at the time as well. And something to say about that is that I was 18 at the time, and they were really trying to move the day because they were just so worried about it. Like, people genuinely thought that this was real. That's why I said this is an insider thing. I remember very vividly the conversations that people would have about this when they're thinking that 666 is some type of satanic signal or just something bad is going to happen. It's giving us an omen. It's a warning, even though, of course, it's 2006, but it was the 6th year of the new millennium, and people thought that it was going to be somewhat significant in a particular way. But some people even just leave this open to debate on the internet. They're like saying that it's possible that he may have had some type of connection to that. What I can say is that Richard Ramirez was sentenced to death, and I believe there was a female follower that wanted to commit suicide at the same time that Richard Ramirez was going to die. Those types of things have been tied into this, and these people in prison on death row who are very famous, like Charles Manson as well, also corresponded with many different followers, and they developed these types of relationships. Those things are not unheard of. But I just think that this is one thing that is somewhat valuable to talk about. But is this a case where somebody has taken the exploration into this morbid and miserable curiosity to lengths that are too far? Is that what happened? Well, I am not 100% sure because I always want to have a greater understanding of humanity. I always want to have a greater awareness of humanity. I mean, is that really what you think would happen to this? We can ask that as our first challenge question. Do you believe that this is simply a case of somebody who took an exploration into morbid curiosity too far, and that led to the deterioration of Jason Moss's mental state? Or do you believe that something else was going on, and that was one of the motivations for his suicide? I know there's going to be types of speculation involved, but it's good to think about like the way that humanity functions, and Jason Moss would probably agree to that. Let's jump over to a different article here on viralnova.com. When Jason Moss was an 18-year-old college freshman, he had an obsession with success. Moss's goal was to have a career in law enforcement, specifically the FBI. As a way to ensure his future ambitions, Moss got creative. For his honors thesis at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, Moss became pen pals with 5 of America's most notorious incarcerated serial killers. Those murderers included John Wayne Gacy, Charles Manson, and Jeffrey Dahmer. But we should say, though, that I believe he began the correspondence with Gacy when he was 18 years old and a college freshman. Gacy was also known as the Killer Clown and was one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy was responsible for the deaths of at least 33 teenage boys and young men in the Chicago area. And they were talking about this on 2020 when they were saying that at the time, Gacy was the most prolific serial killer in America, but that is absolutely not true now. I mean, we also have people like Samuel Little who murdered perhaps over 90 people. I mean, allegedly. Richard Kuklinski also boasted of a big body count, but it doesn't necessarily appear that Kuklinski's claims were all backed up. But I mean, people have murdered more than 33 people. We should say that much. Gacy sent letters to Moss as well with graphic and disturbing instructions for sexual acts that Moss was to commit for Gacy. Over the course of their correspondence, Moss received over 100 letters from Gacy, some of which included hand-drawn pictures. And what I can say is, if you ever do get a chance to watch the movie Dear Mr. Gacy, one point that I've said before on the channel, but I would like to reiterate, is that Gacy is played by William Forsythe. And I mean, it's just an absolutely chilling presentation, because I think that William Forsythe captured the dark side of John Wayne Gacy very well. Earlier this week on the channel, we were talking about the film To Catch a Killer with Brian Dennehy playing John Wayne Gacy, and I thought that was absolutely great because he captured the lighter side, the gray area side, and the darker side of Gacy. But William Forsythe really, just like the evil presence that wants to be the psychopathic torture murderer, I thought that was perhaps one of the best on the subject. But we're going back to the article here, and says that Jason Moss is now going to recap some things about what it was like being alone in a room with John Wayne Gacy. Alone in that room, Gacy began to psychologically torture and belittle Moss. During the course of their 2-day visit, Gacy made it very clear to Moss that he was in his power and that he had the power to kill him at any moment. Later, Moss recounted that it was obvious that Gacy wanted to have sex with him during that visit. And what I heard Jason Moss say in an interview was that there was a chair in the room, and I can only expect that Gacy wanted to bend Moss over the chair, but Jason Moss was saying that Gacy expected to use the chair during sex. Later, Jason Moss, oh yes, we read that one. Lucky for Moss, just as Gacy was becoming even more unstable, a guard knocked on the door and Moss got out of there. He felt that even though he had not been physically harmed, in many ways, he was like Gacy's last victim. And as we said, he did go on to commit suicide in 2006. So, I mean, you want to talk about the last victim going to some new levels. Eventually, as a way of processing his emotions, he turned to his experiences into a book, The Last Victim. Sadly, Moss never fully recovered from his experiences and committed suicide on June 6th of 2006. Now, the last thing they have here is just about the show 2020, which says, in 1999, Jason Moss and his relationship with John Wayne Gacy was the subject of an episode of ABC 2020, which you can see on YouTube for free. I mean, of course, it's available here on YouTube. I watched it earlier today, and I could understand the impulse for Moss to try something like this, but there is no doubt that he was wholly unequipped to venture into the twisted minds of these killers. You can find his book, The Last Victim, for sale on Amazon. Now, there's a big exception that I would take to that right there. There's an enormous difference between trying to venture into the mind of killers and actually going to meet someone face-to-face when you don't necessarily know all the events that are going to happen because unforeseen circumstances took place. Venture into the minds of serial killers. I mean, anybody who watches a serial killer documentary is venturing into the mind of a serial killer. But there has to come a certain point when you just begin to question narratives, and you're like, wait a second, is that really true? Think about the things we said about Samuel Little or Richard Kuklinski, and we're just like, now wait a second, did they do all of the things that they claim to have done? I mean, what exactly is going on there? And human beings just have this absolute desire for the truth, for understanding, to know what's on the other side of the wall, to know what's around the corner on the dark side of the moon. We have this desire to learn things. And this is one of the aspects of humanity that we also need to learn about. That's why we talk about it on this channel, because we can't just censor ourselves and say that, hey, this stuff is too dark and too dangerous. We're not going to learn about it. I don't believe that that is any type of appropriate way to live. But at the same time, there's an enormous difference between corresponding with someone and actually spending time alone with them, as well as Jason Moss didn't only try to get into the mind of the serial killer. As we said about how they were being critical of the subtitle in his book, I mean, they were also saying that it was really also about creating these fictionalized personas, and it's about Jason Moss's journey using these fictionalized personas to get in touch with these serial killers, playing this part, and perhaps the parts that he was playing were the things that got out of hand. So we just have one last thing to share here. We have an article that was written by an individual named H. Henderson Zen, who says that Jason Moss was University of Nevada Las Vegas student, turned his obsession with serial killers into the best-selling book, The Last Victim, and he killed himself in Henderson, Nevada, over the course of last weekend. This, of course, is coming from 2006. Jason Moss, age 31, died in June 6 after shooting himself in the head in a home bathroom, according to the Clark County Coroner's Office. There is nothing to suggest anything except suicide, Henderson police spokesperson Keith Paul said. In 1999, Moss landed on top of the New York Times list of the nation's top-selling books with The Last Victim, a graphic tell-all about his close encounters with infamous serial killers including Gacy, Dahmer, Richard Ramirez, and Charles Manson. Friends were asking Monday if there was any significance to Moss's decision to kill himself on 6606, a date similar to 666, which is said to be the number of the beast in the Book of Revelations. Moss studied devil worship for preparation before corresponding with Richard Ramirez, a Satanist. It struck me that he did it on 666. I wonder if it was coincidence or planned. I really have to tell you, people did talk about that super frequently. When Jason Moss was 19, he used trickery to develop pen-pal relationships with the murderers, portraying himself in letters as a worshiper or a victim to fit each killer's fantasies. Now, is it possible that that is what really got out of hand? But The Last Victim's lurid copy, including sexually explicit letters from Dahmer and Gacy, led to it selling by the truckload only days after its publication. The hardcover racked up 76,000 sales in the first 10 weeks. And just the final thing to say here is that Moss landed on a variety of nationally broadcast shows from 2020 to Hard Copy to the Howard Stern show. That is one thing that I did not know, that Jason Moss appeared on Howard Stern, and I haven't heard that interview, but I definitely want to right now. Now, this is also, the last thing that I would say in conclusion is that we have one description right here, and this is somebody saying about what Jason Moss was like right before his suicide. He sounded harried and busy. He talked about being excited about doing litigation, that he still hadn't lost a case. I keep replaying the conversation in my head. Did I miss a cry for help? But I can pretty vividly recreate that conversation, and it was just Jason, as usual. I mean, I think that there comes to a certain point in life when we won't get all the answers, we won't get closure. We have a desire for them. Humanity always wants to know, but sometimes the desire and the answers may be just a little bit out of reach, and that's what it seems like is going on with the suicide of Jason Moss. And the name of this website is mydeathspace.com. The reason why I didn't say it earlier was I really just almost like a poor taste title, mydeathspace.com, but I did want to cite this source coming to us from Henderson, Nevada. Well, that's where we're going to have to leave it at for now. What do you think about the whole concept of serial killer psychology? And what is your response to that challenge question that we had? Is this something that Jason Moss created that took things too far, or does this have to be a different psychological issue that would have played a larger role in his suicide? I would love to hear anything that you have to say at all. Please drop your ideas in the comment section below. I want to read them. And if you like this upload, you can hit the like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, you're welcome to do so. But most importantly, please drop something in the comments section so we can continue the discussion. That's all for me now, and I will see you on Instagram for the bonus podcast. Until next time.